My name is Katie Yates, and this is Season 5 of the Maine Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife's podcast, Fishing Game Changers. In this season, I've been learning so much about Maine's moose, how they're managed, and how the department is working hard to keep the moose herd healthy and to gain an understanding about the rising issue of winter tick. If you don't know much about winter tick, or maybe you think you do know a lot about winter tick, today's episode is all about winter tick. Lee Kantar, MDIFW's moose biologist / Maine's moose superhero, regional biologists, and other collaborators have been working to closely monitor the health of Maine's moose. In last week's episode, we talked about 3 different ways MDIFW monitors the moose herd using helicopters.
I'm not a thrill seeker. Maybe when I was, 30 years ago.
Really?
But
get up in a helicopter all the time and
yeah,
you're not thrilled?
I have no sense of adventure in me, and the guys will tell you too when we start to have a problem with the communications and something's not working right in the helicopter. It gets me, really edgy. Like I just need to focus. Like, can I just focus on moose? And I don't want to focus on anything else. I need to just But, there's moments flying over the state, flying over Moosehead Lake where, again, you appreciate the natural world. You appreciate, what an incredible state it is. But, flying and seeing these moose, 100 moose in 73 minutes. And, there's an enjoyable part of that for sure. It's mixed with a lot of tension in the air, but it's, we have an incredible resource that we do want to conserve for future generations.
One survey allows biologists to determine the moose population, and it involves flying up and down the wildlife management districts in the moose's core range. Another survey involves flying to prime moose habitat and identifying the bulls, cows, and calves in that area.
A biologist, depending on what we're trying to do for management, is always trying to figure out ways to understand a population of animals. And for moose, we want to know 4 things. We want to know, if possible, we want to know how many there are out there. We want to know what kind, meaning the number of bulls, the number of cows, the number of calves. We want to know their survival rates every year. What's the survival rate of a bull? What's the survival rate of a cow? What's the survival rate of a calf? And we want to know how many they produce every year. And I hate to use the word accounting, but it's an accounting system. How many moose do we gain every year? How many moose do we lose? And those 4 cornerstones, if you can collect that data, that's incredible.
The last study we talked about was the moose collaring study. In 2014, MDIFW initiated a GPS collar study to assess adult cow and calf moose survival. This study is also super important because if the cow or calf dies, Lee gets an automated text. He then travels to the moose and performs a necropsy or moose autopsy to figure out the cause of death.
When we talk about health for moose, in my mind and what came through with the 2017 Big Game Management Plan was health is marked by not seeing diseased animals, by not seeing animals with lots of parasites, and seeing cows that when you compare them to cows across other states and provinces, they produce a lot of calves and a good amount of twins. That's a healthy population. In Maine, we have such a unique situation we talked about before, which is we have moose that live in an environment that produces a ton of food for moose. There's the adults have high survival rates, and so we grow a lot of moose.
Moose in Maine have it made. There's ample food and habitat for them to explore. For these reasons, their population is stable, but a bit too dense in certain wildlife management districts. In episode 1, I mentioned population density can throw things off balance, causing influxes in disease, starvation, and conflicts with people and other animals.
Because there's also no top-down predators of moose, and so adults have high survival rates. And if there's lots of food out there, and if there's no parasites, living is easy. And really, southern Quebec, northern New Brunswick, and northern Maine is a area of moose abundance that most people don't even realize. And it's really because of those circumstances.
Throughout Lee's collaring study, winter tick was beginning to demonstrate its impact and effect on the metabolic function of moose, often leading to death.
Now, when you look at our study, in 7 years of our study, 6 out of those 7 years in that western unit, we had calf mortality of collared calves where it was greater than 50% losses. Wow. So let me say that again. So in 6 of the 7 years, our collared calves in our western unit, we lost more than half of them, died, those collared animals, from winter tick. We recovered those animals, necropsied them, covered in ticks, massive weight loss. Yes, there's some other parasites like lungworm, but really, you talk to the pathologists that we've worked with, and that's what killed them. You remove the winter ticks, you don't have any winter ticks, you're not going to find that many moose. Calves dead. That's just not going to happen. So that's really important. The other thing is that winter ticks get on all moose, so it's not just the calves. The calves have the big problem because they go in a winter without any fat. Now the adult cow, let's talk about her briefly, which is she enters the winter. She's got fat. Maybe she's pregnant in the fall. Now she's going through the winter time. And things are all right, but now the ticks emerge on her. They were on her, and now they start feeding. Well, now they're feeding the adult ticks, the worst part, in March and April. Well, now she's got a fetus, a moose fetus, a little calf inside her that needs to grow from her resources. Well, her resources are being taken away by the winter tick. And if she's got a real bad infestation, it makes them eat less because they're spending time scratching and itching, and it's driving them crazy. It's taking their mind off the ball, and they're losing weight. But no matter what condition she's in, and they've done studies in Quebec with this, she can be in really poor condition. She'll still give birth to that calf. Problem is, when she gives birth to that calf, it may weigh half of what it should weigh, and it's not going to live. It's going to die.
Before moving to Maine in 2018, I literally had only seen one tick in my entire life. When my first winter in Maine turned into my first spring, I went for a walk with my dogs. As I was driving home, I felt something in my hair. Ticks. Ticks were in my hair. Dropping on my lap, crawling on my face. Suddenly, I saw them on my steering wheel and all over my hands. I was covered in them, and so were my dogs. Basically, a nightmare. Tick prevention and safety were never on my mind until I moved to Maine. But since being more mindful about ticks, wearing appropriate clothes, and performing routine tick checks after spending time outside, I haven't had that tick raining from my hair while driving moment since. If you find a tick on you after a quick walk in the woods, it's more than likely a deer or dog tick. There are 15 species of tick in Maine, but only 2 are of real concern for humans. In addition to being gross, blood-sucking little monsters, they carry diseases such as Lyme disease, which can be lifelong and cause serious long-term health issues. Throughout their life cycle, deer and dog ticks attach to hosts of opportunity, joining them for a quick meal and then hopping off. They switch host for a variety of reasons, which I'll get into later, and they're usually riding solo. They don't bring a friend along for the journey. I didn't know this before making this episode, but there are all kinds of crazy ticks out there, specialized for different hosts. Woodchuck ticks, seabird ticks, and even beaver ticks. Winter tick survives on the blood of animals just like the 15 other tick species in Maine. Ugh. Though they are capable of feeding on many different species, winter tick infestations are most commonly found on moose.
So it's not a deer tick, it's not a dog tick. It looks just like a dog tick. This really confuses people. All other ticks like deer and dog ticks have 3 different hosts. They get on 3 different animals and take blood from 3 different animals to fill their life cycle over 2 to 3 years.
Most other tick species move to a different host for each developmental stage, larvae, nymph, and adult, not winter tick. Winter ticks feed on a single animal for all 3 stages, consistently eroding its health from fall to spring.
The winter tick takes 3 meals from the same animal in one winter. Sorry, I'm banging on the table. One host tick that lives for 1 year. So in one winter, it's taking 3 meals, and it's doing that on anything it can get on.
In late spring, fully fed adult female winter ticks drop off their host to seek leaf litter, where they may lay up to 4,000 eggs. My upstate New York accent's sneaking through here. The eggs hatch in late summer or early fall, at which point the larvae climb vegetation, or questing for an organism to be its host.
When the winter ticks are looking for something in the fall, we call this questing. They're waiting on a shrub for something to walk by.
They can sense vibrations and detect CO2 from an animal up to 20 meters away. And as a passing moose brushes by one tick, thousands of others come with it using their interlocking limbs.
They get on the moose, and the moose doesn't realize this. So other animals, whether it's a snowshoe hare or a deer, are able to groom themselves and get the majority of ticks on them. They certainly may carry a few, but a moose can have 50, 60, 70, 80, 90,000 ticks on them. And so when those ticks take a meal, they're taking enough blood that the moose gets affected by it, and the moose has to replace that blood to live every day. And so this happens 3 different times. Usually in the fall as a larvae, the tick's feeding on the moose, and then it lays kind of dormant on the moose until December, January. Then it feeds as a nymph, and then moose take notice. That's when they start to rub and groom themselves, and they start to experience hair loss from the grooming. And these ticks are voraciously feeding on the moose. And then it culminates in March and April when the adult ticks, which look now much larger, will feed on the moose. And a single adult female can take about 1 ml of blood from a moose. So if you have 50,000 ticks on a moose, and let's just say half of them are females, and you have 25,000 feeding, you see where I'm going. You're taking a lot of blood that is not easily, produced by the moose to replace in that period of time, which can be a couple weeks of mass feeding. So now this podcast is all about winter tick.
A whole episode.
So, yeah.
So, unlike ticks you might be familiar with, winter ticks do not spread disease. The problem is they attach by the thousands and stay for 5 or 6 months, causing moose to experience significant blood loss, hair loss, and even behavioral change. Lee mentioned in last week's episode that throughout the decades, influxes in winter tick coincided with hunters and outdoors people noticing perished moose on the landscape. As with everything, there are natural rhythms that keep our ecosystem balanced. A warmer winter led to more winter ticks, which would impact moose population that year, but the next winter would be harsher, and this would be less of an issue. So why is this suddenly a big, huge problem?
There's all kinds of talk we hear about winter tick, and we already talked about the one host, 1 year life cycle, which is really critical. People wonder why now, right? And is this alien or invasive, et cetera, et cetera? But the facts is that we've always had winter tick, and believe it or not only is there winter tick here, but winter tick lives from southern Canada. They're limited by winter weather and the length of winter, but all the way down to Texas. And they can be a real pest with things like elk out west and moose and other animals, but moose take it more than anybody else, because of this fall situation where they're not aware the ticks are on them. We can date winter tick back, I want to either say the 30s or the 20s, so I can look back in hard copies in this office and look back and see where biologists and wardens have documented ticks on moose. And even ticks on moose, in some interesting time periods. So, It shows that maybe at some point there were some cycles going on with winter tick and all that because of the relationship to the climate. But one of the most striking things that I mentioned earlier is that other jurisdictions, Canadian provinces, have seen where one year, one spring, they find a whole mess of dead moose. But you don't see a lot where 2 years they've done that, right?
Recently, climate change in the form of shorter, milder winters has allowed winter ticks to thrive. Despite their name, winter ticks can't survive cold winters without a host. Late fall gives nymphs extra time to find a host, and early springs give female ticks abundant leaf litter to lay their eggs in.
So the long story short is, as the 2000s came in, and now we're 21 years into the 2000s, not only have we had, no pun intended, an uptick in this parasite called the winter tick, but we've had a climate that has moderated. And if you talk to the Climate Council people at the University of Maine, who are experts in this field, what they will tell you is that we have 2 weeks that used to be 2 weeks of winter, has now changed to 2 more weeks of basically summer and fall. Now, 2 weeks may not sound like a lot to people, but when you talk about the duration of a 20-week winter and snow on the ground and the conditions that make it winter, and you take away 2 weeks, it has a lot of ramifications for the environment and for moose as well. And one thing that it's done is it has allowed, along with a high moose density, this growth of the winter tick.
What does winter tick do to a calf moose and cow? Just a warning, this part's a little sad. A calf moose has very little body fat going into the winter and can't replace the blood fast enough. The winter and spring food availability has low nutritional value, preventing calves from replenishing adequate blood supply and fat reserves. This results in calves not only losing blood from winter tick, but body weight as well. In fact, a calf may lose nearly 100 pounds or 20 to 30% of their body weight between the months of January and March or April. By March, with depleted blood volume, caloric deficits, and little hair to keep them warm, tick-infested calves around 10 months old will often succumb to the elements. In some parts of the core moose range, calves under a year old will experience greater than 50% mortality. Pregnant cows who are trying to care for their fetus and themselves are also vulnerable. By spring, pregnant cows and their fetus are often so anemic and malnourished that the newborn calf in the spring may have a much reduced chance of surviving.
Moose are different than deer. Deer, of course, have their fawns in June, and in June when they have their fawns, it's green out there. Mm-hmm. And the fawns can hide in the grass, and the doe is got all kinds of green food to eat. In May, early May to mid-May, when moose are calving, it hasn't even greened up yet in moose country. That cow who's now just bore a calf and is lactating has no good food to eat. That's the way life is for moose. So I'm not saying that to make a comment that, moose have it rough. I mean, it's like we all have different lives. That's a moose's life. What's making it rough is when you throw 50,000 ticks on her, right, and then she's trying to do the same thing.
And if a yearling cow does survive, they typically are in poor condition, so they do not gain enough mass to breed until a much later age, around 3 years old.
So there's plenty of evidence that because of that energetic demand, we face the problem of cows are having less viable calves. We know they're not having calves like they used to have, meaning if you look at all the cows overall, less cows are having calves every year, because to become pregnant, to be a cow that becomes pregnant in the fall, you have to maintain and reach a certain weight. And then you start to ovulate. If you don't weigh enough, you're not going to ovulate. So typically that would happen where a moose would gain that size by the time she's 2 years old. She'd be big enough to start ovulating and become pregnant and have a calf, and life is good. And some yearlings would be big enough as well. But when you get a pile of ticks on you every year, including when you're a female calf, you start off your life, you survive, you get born in May, you go through your first winter, you made it to your next birthday. Now you're 1 year old you're a 1-year-old yearling female, you're now depleted. Yeah, you survived the ticks, but now you weigh a lot less. Now you got June, July, and August and September to get back on it. And are you going to ovulate and become pregnant? No, I don't think so. Once in a while, we do have yearlings that can attain that. So then you go into your next winter, and you're behind the 8 ball, and you get ticks on you again. And you're depleted again. So by the time you're a 2-year-old, you're still not in great shape. So it looks like it's taking moose longer over time to get to that point where they're weighing enough to become pregnant, and then to carry that through and have a successful pregnancy, successful calving. And we think that we have good evidence from New Hampshire and Maine study that every year, moose aren't having a calf every year because of this as well. So they get, taxed in 1 year pretty badly if they bring their calf through, and then the next year it may not. So it's really problematic, compounds itself.
Cows are much less likely to have twins as they get older, resulting in lower reproductive rates. Remember in last week's episode, Lee mentioned that Maine's moose have a low twinning rate, indicative of a problem.
We also see way less twinning rates than we used to have. So twinning rates of moose, when a moose has 2 calves, has always been considered a function in the moose world of good habitat and a population of moose that is the right number of moose, that they have plenty of feed and life is good and they have lots of twins. Western North Dakota has a really healthy moose population where they have lots of twins and tons of food. The problem with Maine is that there's no indication that it's a food problem, but what it is it's a parasite problem. And so it's acting the same way. And so we see far less twins.
A winter tick infestation has major physiological effects on moose. During the winter, when moose should be focused on staying safe, warm, and fed, those with winter tick infestations will instead spend over 2 hours a day grooming. By contrast, those without infestation spend less than 5 minutes. This burns excess energy, causes insulative hair loss, steals time and attention from the task of finding food, and makes moose distracted, disoriented, and vulnerable to disease.
So a moose acquires the ticks in the fall, and then sometime in midwinter, a moose can be successful in getting rid of ticks, getting them off. I'm flicking my fingers here. Moose don't have fingers, but, they're using their rear hooves, and they can scratch off the ticks. And so when a moose is walking from point A to B, it's losing some ticks and successful. But then there's places where the moose beds down, or a lethargic moose that's really not in great condition is laying in a place where there's some softwood shelter and hanging out there, and there's just ticks coming off that animal like crazy. Well, the next fall, that moose is coming right through the same areas and picking up the next generation of ticks from maybe the same, And so it's a compounding problem because, moose love, cuts, choppings that are fairly new, a few years old to 15 years, and they spend a lot of time there, and you get a bunch of moose in there, and the more moose you get into those cuts, there's ticks. Everybody's got some load of ticks from the fall into the spring. And so they're literally reseeding ticks into places where they're going to be in the fall.
Now, what is MDIFW's plan to stop winter tick in its tracks? To carry out the right solution, MDIFW first needed to know exactly what was happening, how, why, and where. Remember, MDIFW launched a GPS collar study to assess calf and cow moose survival throughout their core range from 2014 to 2020. That's what we were talking about in last week's episode. The results were clear. Winter tick loads significantly impact the amount of calves living to be 1 year old and impacts cows' reproductive rates. The department has also kept close track of instances where heavy tick infestations, 40,000 to 60,000 ticks per moose, have led to juvenile mortality and chronic loss of physical condition in adult cows, leading to reduced fecundity, or the number of potential offspring a moose can have over a lifetime. In last week's episode, Lee mentioned he is routinely learning from and connecting with other moose biologists, or moose people, as he calls them. Moose research in other parts of North America shows that moose that live at low population densities have fewer ticks. And we've already talked about how dense Maine's moose population really is. Think back to episode 1. This is due to a lack of top-down predators and ample food and habitat. To determine if moose density reduction can solve the winter tick problem in Maine, MDIFW is currently conducting a multi-phase adaptive management study. That's something you're going to hear a lot from now on, so keep that phrase in mind.
This is a question that we're still trying to answer. We're working still with UNH and a postdoc on this, but there's a lot of variability between the moose and how many ticks they have on them. So when we captured these 70 moose, for instance, just a couple weeks ago, we have some moose that have extremely high tick loads on them, which is not good. And then we have some with very low. And so we're trying to find the nuances of why that's happening, even in the same area, and so there's always more questions to answer. I mean, right now we're working with 4 different universities on moose and ticks and associated questions about moose. If this population would continue to grow, or maybe not, you run into this risk of, especially with climate being as erratic as it is, we could experience years where maybe we start to have higher adult mortality from winter tick. We've seen it once in those 7 years where we lost close to 50% of our adult cows in that western unit. Those are the things we're trying to tease out that are tied together. But definitely density, high to moderate density of moose. And again, we mentioned this too, which is our moose densities are much higher than what would be considered a quote unquote, normal population of moose. And all we're saying right now at this point is we're going to take 6% of the core range, 1/2 of one management district, and test the theory based on good science that if we can bring the moose population down lower, that we can make that population more healthy. We can determine whether it works or not.
Remember, moose's core range is Wildlife Management Districts, or WMDs, numbered 1 through 11 and 19. You can find this map by visiting our website, mefishwildlife.com. The moose's core range in Maine covers 16,000 square miles, which is about 10 million acres. For the purpose of the Adaptive Management Study, Wildlife Management District 4, which is approximately 2,000 square miles in the northwestern part of the state, has been divided into 2 similarly sized sections. MDIFW is proposing to allow increased hunting in the western half of WMD 4, just about 1,000 square miles in the fall of 2021 to reduce the moose population density in that area. In the eastern half of WMD 4, as well as all other wildlife management districts open to moose hunting, moose permits will remain at normal levels. During this adaptive hunt, biologists will collect several data points from harvested moose in either subsection of WMD 4, including canine teeth, antler spreads, winter tick counts, ovaries, and carcass weights. In addition, biologists will continue aerial surveys and monitoring calves with GPS collars. This adaptive hunt will run until 2025, at which point biologists will assess: did reducing the moose density result in lower mortality because of winter tick?
And that's an important part, is that unlike some management, I know right now, looking at you, that I can measure those things every year, which is critical. You would not want to do this kind of an operation without being able to measure those things. And we've talked about those ways: aerial surveys, GPS collars on moose, which is intensive. And like I said, we just did 70 collars in there last week. So we're doing all the right things to be able to measure this and provide evidence of what we're doing. So, it's really good and it's important, and that's what we're looking at doing in the coming year. And what happens years from now, 5 years from now, I can't tell you what's going to happen or how that's going to change things or not change things.
The hypothesis is that after 5 years of this study, we will find that lower moose density leads to lower winter tick levels and healthier moose. I'm actually amazed by the number of people and the amount of brain power that's being focused.
Brain power?
Yeah, a lot of.
Minus me. Yeah.
Yeah,
but
minus you.
yeah.
But all of the dedicated people who are putting so much time and energy into researching this and studying it. It's not just one person sitting around thinking about it.
Yeah.
It is an entire network of really qualified people thinking about it and researching it.
Yeah, and our connection with New Brunswick and Quebec is a vital one, and Quebec especially. I mean, they have a significant moose population, and hunting is a significant part of the culture. So that's really, really interesting. In the Northeast, Quebec and New Brunswick are starting to experience some winter tick issues along the border, especially, latitudinally. And so there's a lot of concerns there. And I've been in touch and worked with the Quebec guys for a number of years. And we've gotten even a little bit more talkative. And now I'm also an advisor with a new PhD student at University of New Brunswick who are working with Laval in Quebec on moose and the issues of winter tick. So now little old Maine in our program is working with 4 different universities right now to continue on our research, management, assessment of moose and everything moose and winter ticks and all that. And so that's a good thing for the state. I mean, it is, and it's a good thing for the resource because, again, like I said at the beginning of this, which is, it's like you never stop learning. It's hard. It would be hard to be that person who says, well, yeah, I know it all. It's like I never feel that way. I wake up every morning. I think about moose every day. Maybe that's not a good thing. But yeah, I mean, it is my life. It's been my life. But the phenomenon of winter tick being a driving force on our moose population is fairly unique. So people look at moose populations across North America and all kinds of different stuff is happening. There's moose that, in Wyoming, it's the carotid arterial worm and habitat as being a limiting factor, for instance. It's not a winter tick. And then there's areas like in Manitoba, where in southern Manitoba, they're gaining moose, but in northern Manitoba, they're losing moose. And there's lots of issues between the indigenous people and the Manitobans, and there's social issues there with the moose as a resource. Places like North Dakota, where close to Minnesota, they've lost their moose, but in western North Dakota, which is a lot of agricultural lands, they have moose where if we showed you a picture, you'd be like, that doesn't even make any sense to me. And you got all these moose there? Wow. It doesn't even look right. And so it's all over the board. And Utah is a place that has winter tick and experiencing winter tick, which you think of as this arid climate. But it's only here in the Northeast, Maine, New Hampshire, and Vermont, and seeping into probably the provinces where winter tick is such a big deal every year. And that's, this whole combination of things driven by, our humid climate and moose densities and all this type of thing. So it's important that we have that, as you said, network, and that we have many people working on it.
In next week's episode, we're going to talk more about the Adaptive Management Study and next steps. We'll also talk about the process of determining permit numbers for hunters, and we'll review some of the public's frequently asked questions and suggestions to reduce winter tick. If you want to learn more about this podcast, the Adaptive Management Study, winter tick, or Maine's moose, visit mefishwildlife.com/changers. If you are enjoying Fishing Game Changers on the Apple Podcast app, leave us a rating and let us know what you think.